I'm joined now by Adam Klasfeld of All Rise News. Adam, you did an excellent report on the implications of the DOJ meeting between Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell on the victims of the whole Epstein situation. Can you explain a little bit about the response of the victims in light of this DOJ meeting?
Well, the victims have been iced out, Brian. The problem is, and it happened even before the Ghislaine Maxwell meeting, which is shocking on its own for reasons that we can discuss soon. But remember when Todd Blanche went to unseal the grand jury minutes, two federal judges, and this is what set me out of my investigation, two federal judges wrote identical sentences in their orders, basically saying that the government hadn't done enough. And the sentence was, the government may not have notified the victims. So I wanted to check that out. They said may. Did they or did they not notify the victims? So I reached out to an attorney for the victims who represents hundreds of victims. And Sigrid McCauley gave me an on the record comment saying that the government failed in its obligations to notify the victims. So let's set the numbers aside. Sigrid McCauley represented the late Virginia Giuffre, the Epstein victim who won the settlement against Prince Andrew, who sued Ghislaine Maxwell in a lawsuit that arguably set off a lot of these prosecutions, along with the reporting of the Miami Herald. She also represents the Farmer sisters, Annie and Maria Farmer. Annie Farmer testified against Ghislaine Maxwell. Maria Farmer and Annie Farmer were the first known people to complain to law enforcement about Jeffrey Epstein. So when Sigrid McCauley gives me an on-the-record statement that the government failed to notify the victims, that carries weight. And just think of what that means. Before, at the earliest stages of this, the victims who have had decades of experience being ignored, disregarded by law enforcement. Remember, this whole thing started with that sweetheart deal in 2007 and 2008 with the 2006 investigation with Jeffrey Epstein, where the victims weren't notified that Jeffrey Epstein was getting off with a slap on the wrist. And now it's starting all over again, where the Trump administration is doing what it's doing to try to outrun this scandal. Trump is sending his personal defense attorney, Todd Blanche, the second top official in the Justice Department, first on this gambit to try to unseal the grand jury records, which is not the transparency that people were asking for. It's
Right.
probably going to reveal very, very little if they get anything unsealed at all because it's so protected. And then sends Todd Blanche to interview Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, I mentioned Annie Farmer a moment ago. Remember, Annie Farmer testified against Ghislaine Maxwell, and her lawyer wasn't notified about the Trump administration's maneuvers. Now, putting that into perspective, what she testified was that Ghislaine Maxwell had given her a massage and touched her chest during that massage when she was victimized, she says, by both Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And it's important. People actually very often forget this part of the story. Ghislaine Maxwell was accused of participating in the abuse. And there's another reason why I bring up Annie Farmer's testimony. It's because folks have heard, and it's a widely known fact, Ghislaine Maxwell was charged with 2 counts of perjury. Now, we have to remember, what was she charged with lying about? First, she was in a deposition, and this was a deposition again in this case by Virginia Giuffre, this lawsuit by Virginia Giuffre that arguably started all of this. And in one of the depositions, she denied knowing anything about Jeffrey Epstein's recruiting young women and girls to give him massages that escalated into sexual abuse, denied knowing anything about that. And then in a separate deposition, claimed that she had never given a massage. So again, I emphasize that point because what we learned years later at trial, that not only had she given a massage, she had given this unwanted massage to Annie Farmer, who she told to get nude before the massage to have her undressed. And touched her, Annie Farmer says, on her chest. And so that's when folks, talk about the victims being iced out here, their own attorney has been left in the dark about what the DOJ is doing, what Trump's personal attorney is doing. That remember, it was Todd Blanche also who had moved to unseal the grand jury minutes. He's sending not the people who convicted Ghislaine Maxwell. No, he fired the prosecutor who convicted Ghislaine Maxwell, Maureen Comey. He is sending the number two in the Justice Department, which would be weird enough and inexplicable enough on its own. But combined with the fact that it's his personal attorney, combined with the reporting in the Wall Street Journal and the scandal that's surrounding him, I think that there have just been statements, not speaking for the victims or even hearing from their lawyer. The victims themselves are talking about how upsetting it is to watch all of this go forward. I think that Annie Farmer herself just spoke to the BBC on this topic. So yes, the victims are being iced out and they're telling people publicly how much they don't like it. And I'll add one more point. Annie Farmer's sister, Maria Farmer, also an Epstein victim, spoke to the New York Times in their bombshell investigation. And so we're seeing the victims speak up, and they don't like what they're seeing.
I gotta ask, wasn't the whole point of this, whether it was Trump promising to release these files, Dan Bongino, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Alina Habba, Don Jr., Megyn Kelly, everybody in the right-wing media ecosystem who was clamoring for accountability, wasn't it so that these victims would get the accountability they deserve? Wasn't it so that the perpetrators of these crimes would be held to account for the benefit of those victims itself? So what does it say that all of these people for whom the accountability would be on behalf of get iced out of this process now?
Right. Well, I mean, it should be every decent person's concern for this issue. If they're concerned about this issue, it should be justice for the victims. And the fact that it doesn't seem to be an afterthought in even something as simple as unsealing grand jury records suggests that there's something else at play here. And if you go to, for example, QAnon's interest in it, it has always been retribution against an enemy, that this had always been considered this day of justice against this shadowy cabal, and in their mythology, that Donald Trump was the opponent of the people who they imagined.
Right.
But when it comes to real flesh and blood victims, they're the ones who are being ignored by those conspiracy theorists. They're the ones that are being ignored by this administration. If there were true care for the victims, you would think that you would go for the people, you would go and turn to the prosecutors who brought at least some measure of justice, however incomplete, that through the prosecution and the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell, and say, how can we advance this investigation? How can we find out what other perpetrators might be out there? No, they're firing those people, and they're turning to the political appointees, and they're not hearing from the victims.
When you were speaking to the attorney for the victims, Did you broach at all the topic of the prospect of a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell? Because that would be, I mean, you want to talk about completely antithetical to what they claim that this would all be for, which is accountability for the victims. You've got somebody in Ghislaine Maxwell who is the perpetrator of these crimes, currently serving 20 years for her participation in all of this stuff. And now she may be the person to walk free, presumably because if she has information that would implicate Donald Trump, in exchange for her silence on this issue, Trump has the ability to either pardon her or the DOJ might seek to reduce her sentence. And so was that brought up in these conversations while we're discussing, the impact on these victims, justice for these victims?
So my inquiry to Sigrid Macaulay was specifically on this topic, and it was before Todd Blanche went down to Tallahassee, Florida. But I will say there has been some reporting on this. Very recently, you had Brad Edwards, an attorney for also hundreds of Epstein survivors, who went on Lawrence O'Donnell's show on MSNBC and talked about how unsettling it is for his clients to hear about that meeting. That was right before the meeting. He also said, by the way, on MSNBC, on Lawrence O'Donnell's show, that the birthday letter and the birthday book received by Jeffrey Epstein on his 50th birthday is in the possession of the executors of the estate. He named them, said that they would cooperate with the subpoena, so that might come out. But I can say, as someone who sat through every day of Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal trial, that and saw the witnesses take the stand, who saw Annie Farmer as she delivered that testimony about that unwanted massage, and Jane, who testified under a pseudonym about being sexually abused at the age of 14 years old, both by Maxwell and by Jeffrey Epstein. It must be horrifying to them because they went through the process of the trial. Now, we talk about the perjury charges against Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, the only reason that they were dropped was that before the trial, the judge separated the charges, said that the perjury charges would be tried separately. And after the first trial, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of sex trafficking, and the prosecutors had a decision. Do we put these victims through the trauma of a second trial and repeat all this for who knows what? There would be
some marginal benefit, maybe,
Exactly. I mean, they had already secured far more serious convictions against Ghislaine Maxwell. That had resulted in a 20-year sentence. Do they need to put all the resources, another trial, and put the victims through all of that emotional upheaval of reliving all of this a second time? Or do they put it aside? And what they did, and this detail of the story doesn't get communicated as often as it should, they said that if the charges of conviction are upheld on appeal, they won't pursue the perjury charges. So they didn't necessarily drop it. They didn't say, we no longer feel that she's a perjurer. What the prosecutors said was that these victims deserve closure, and so we're going to, in our discretion, not pursue this at this time. But if you watch the trial and you look at what she said, Ghislaine Maxwell, said in those depositions in the lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre, and set it against what came out at trial, it's very clear to see what happened.
Adam, do you think that there is a world in which the meeting between Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell was anything other than trying to figure out how the DOJ would be able to cover for Trump in the event that he is in some way implicated at the hands of the only surviving person who would have all of this information, at her disposal?
I can't see why the DOJ, and an alternative explanation as to why the DOJ would send Todd Blanche. someone who hasn't been living with the case, not one of the line prosecutors, the second top person in the Department of Justice. It's so bizarre on its own that it would be suspicious if Todd Blanche was nobody to Donald Trump, let alone him actually having been the criminal defense attorney for Donald Trump. If he was not Todd Blanche, but Joe Schmo, deputy attorney general, it would be very odd to see the deputy attorney general going to Tallahassee, Florida, to talk to a woman who has been convicted of sex trafficking while she has a pending appeal before the Supreme Court. So there doesn't seem what makes so many people suspicious about the motives here, forgetting about the vindictiveness and the history of cover-ups of Donald Trump, setting all that aside, is that the way this has panned out is so out of the ordinary. I've covered the legal beat for nearly 2 decades now, and it just isn't done that you have the second top person in the Justice Department speaking with a convicted defendant in advance of the Supreme Court deciding whether or not they will hear that person's petition. And that on its own, let alone the second top person in the Justice Department, who, by the way, is the president's former criminal defense attorney. That on its it looks suspicious because it is on its face suspicious.
Yeah, especially on the heels of firing the prosecutor who actually did prosecute this case, who does have the wealth of information, who would be the appropriate person to litigate any of this stuff, as opposed to, again, the former personal attorney for the very guy who may be implicated in everything that we're trying to figure out right now. So look, I think the way that people usually describe this is that this stinks, and I think that your explanation here kind of lent itself to exactly that. One note for my audience is that as Adam continues to investigate all of this stuff, he's doing it for All Rise News, which is an independent publication. I'm an outspoken advocate for supporting independent media, and there's nobody that does it better than Adam. So for those looking to support good, honest journalism that meets this moment with the urgency that it deserves, please support All Rise News. I'm going to put the link to the website right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Adam, I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much, Brian. Always a pleasure.